Well, the coalition is currently debating whether to keep or drop its net zero emissions target. Now, Chris Bowen says Australians have backed in his green agenda.
Despite some of the rhetoric and the argy-bargy, there was a swing to the Labor Party pretty much in every offshore wind seat. I take that as well as an endorsement, as I said in an op-ed today, by the silent majority to say, keep going, get on with the job.
Well, joining me now is the Institute of Public Affairs Chief Economist, Adam Creighton. Adam, Chris Bowen sees this election outcome as an endorsement of his personal policies, despite the fact that Labor's primary is still only 34%. Now, the coalition seems to be undecided on their energy policy. What would you say are the pros and cons of keeping net zero?
Well, the pros are that it is momentarily popular. Certainly, if you did a survey of the community, I think most people would say that they like the idea of net zero. And that's probably because they think net zero means no pollution. But of course, you know, the emissions, the carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Sadly, that's what the general public thinks. But I think as time goes on, I think public opinion is going to change. It's already changing in Europe. You're seeing in Germany, you're seeing in the UK, you're seeing a lot of scepticism about net zero. The reality is net zero might sound, you know, a nice idea, but it's an extraordinarily huge tax on the Australian economy. It's a much, much bigger tax, say, than the Trump tariffs, which we've all got, you know, so exercised and upset about. You know, it's basically destroying our manufacturing. It's putting up energy bills. You know, we have solar and wind in Australia, and it's much easier to introduce it. But the more you introduce, the more costly that it becomes. And I think we're reaching that point now in Australia where it's getting harder and harder to roll more of it out. Without the serious risk of blackouts. And I think Chris Bowen's made a judgment, you know, a very cynical political judgment, that in the next 3 years it's still going to be popular. But I would guarantee that in the next 6 years or 9 years, it's not going to be popular, it's going to be very costly, and it's going to wreck the Australian economy. So I would say the coalition should dump it now and should get ahead of public opinion. Plus, they'd have something to take to the next election, because the last election, they really didn't have much to take. That was distinct from Labor.
And some in the Nationals are saying it should be dumped, and there's already disagreements emerging between the Nationals and the Liberal Party. Of course, the Nationals did outperform the Liberals in the election, and now they're also demanding more portfolios, better portfolios. Here was National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie stoking some of these flames a bit earlier.
In our 120-year history, for 16 of those years, we held the Treasury portfolio in government. So I think there needs to be a very serious conversation heading into any coalition discussions about the role of the National Party.
On portfolio primarily, or policy, or both?
Well, I think this is a partnership that has to work for both parties.
It's just going to be a mess for the coalition. They're not going to agree on policy, and now it looks like they might demand the Treasury portfolio.
Well, it's a reasonable request, I think. The reality is just the raw numbers in the Parliament, in the Senate and the lower house are that the Nationals are a much more powerful political force than they were relative to the Liberal Party. So they may have to give up. They may have to give up that position. And, you know, personally, I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. The National Party were well ahead on the issue of the voice. They came out against it first. They dragged the Liberals into that position. I think that's full credit to them. And I think, you know, he may not have won the leadership, Matt Canavan, one of the regulars on your show, but he appears to have pushed the National Party into dumping net zero. I think that's the right view, as I was just saying, and I think it may cause the Liberals to dump that as well. So I think, you know, in the national interest, you know, full credit to the National Party for leading the debate on these things. And, you know, if there's not unity in the coalition for the next year or so, does that really matter? I mean, let's see a debate. Let's see an intellectual debate on these very important issues. The problem with the last election is the major parties basically agreed on everything substantive.
Just finally, Adam, it looks like Jim Chalmers is going to legislate Labor's super tax. Allegra Spender has come out and said, you know, an appeal to not do this. Paul Keating has as well. Do you have concerns over this policy?
Yeah, look, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, Paul Keating would be considered a far-right figure, I think, now in the Australian political scene. The Labor Party, you know, has moved so far to the left. This is a terrible tax, especially the unrealised gains component. It's not going to be indexed. $3 million is the threshold at the moment that's been specified. You know, it's just so depressing that, you know, we have bracket creep. The government has bracket creep every year, which gives it $5 billion of extra tax every year, but that's still not enough. They need to legislate this other tax. So, look, I hope it doesn't happen. I hope, and this is just my personal view, that maybe the Liberals can negotiate with Labor to pass a less bad tax than Labor negotiating with the Greens to get it through the Senate, because the Greens may well insist that the threshold has to be 2 million. So, look, that's for the parties to decide, but it's a terrible tax. Let's hope it doesn't happen.
All right, Adam Creighton, thank you so much. Appreciate your time.